Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving into something a lot of you can probably relate to, becoming fluent in another language. You guys send in some really cool stuff about learning English, a whole podcast episode with tons of advice and personal stories. So let's jump right in and see what we can learn.
What really fascinates me about language learning is how it's kind of like a mirror for any skill you're trying to learn. It's not just about memorizing stuff, but about going through that whole messy process, trying and failing and trying again.
Yeah, totally. And this podcast, the one we're looking at today, they really emphasize that whole idea that mistakes, they're just part of the journey. Like, there's this story about ordering a latte, right? The
Ah.
speaker totally messed up the grammar, said something like, me want coffee latte. But the barista got it.
Exactly. It's like fluency is way more important than being grammatically perfect, especially in everyday conversations. I think a lot of learners, they get stuck on that, the fear of making mistakes.
It's almost like we need to, I don't know, give ourselves permission to mess up a little bit, right?
Definitely.
The podcast also talked about this idea of thinking directly in English. They suggested things like, imagine you're just walking around your house and narrating what you're doing in your head. Like, now I'm opening the fridge, now I'm making a sandwich. Kind of weird, right? But have you ever tried that?
Oh, yeah. I tell my students to do that all the time. When you make that conscious effort to think in English, you're basically, retraining your brain to skip that whole translation step.
Yeah.
It might feel strained at first, but it really helps speed things up. I even tell people to try, like, recapping their day in English before they go to bed.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I might have to try that. So, okay, let's talk about this shadowing technique. This is where it gets kind of fun. So basically, you listen to native speakers and you just try to mimic them, like you're an actor or something. I used to do this with movies all the time.
Yeah, shadowing is great. You can really improve your pronunciation, your rhythm, even your intonation. It's like you're kind of soaking up the music of the language.
Right, it's like you're internalizing, I don't know, the natural flow of English, how the words and phrases all fit together.
Exactly.
They suggested using things like podcasts and audiobooks for shadowing. Do you have any recommendations for what kind of stuff works best for that?
It really depends on your level and what you're into. Like, if you're just starting out, it's probably best to pick something slower, something clearly enunciated, like maybe children's audiobooks or something. And then as you get better, you can try something more challenging, like podcasts or even movies. The important thing is to choose something you actually enjoy listening to. That's how you'll stay motivated.
Makes sense. And speaking of motivation, the podcast host talked a lot about creating like an immersive environment for yourself, an English-speaking environment. They even said, like, change your phone's language settings to English. It's about surrounding yourself with the language, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't have to be like a huge change. Even small things like listening to English music when you're driving or following English-speaking people on social media, those things can really help.
So it's like that passive learning they talked about, right? Just kind of absorbing the language even when you're not actively studying.
Mhm.
It's amazing how our brains can just like pick up on patterns and learn new words just by being exposed to them. Have you seen that with your students?
Oh, absolutely. The more you can integrate English into your daily life, the
Yeah.
easier it becomes. It's like the more you use it, the more natural it feels, like
Yeah.
building a muscle or something.
And of course, you can't forget about, real conversations. The podcast host told this story about their very first full conversation in English. It was with a tourist who needed directions. They were super nervous, but they were able to actually communicate.
Right. And that just shows how important it is to get out of your comfort zone and actually use the language. Like, that's where the real learning happens. You got to adapt. You got to think on your feet. And that builds confidence.
For sure. But what if what if you don't have people to talk to, like native speakers?
Yeah.
Or you don't have those opportunities for real-life conversations?
Mhm.
The podcast mentioned online language groups and even like AI tools as options.
Yeah, those are great resources. I mean, technology has really opened up so many new ways to learn languages. You can connect with people all over the world and practice speaking from anywhere. It's pretty amazing.
It's like having a conversation partner whenever you want.
Exactly.
But they warned about this trap that language learners can fall into, focusing too much on just memorizing individual words instead of learning whole phrases.
Right. They said something like, instead of just learning the word how, learn the whole phrase, what's up. It's more natural and it's how people actually talk.
It's about capturing like the real essence of the language, how native speakers actually express themselves.
Exactly.
I remember when I was learning Spanish, I got so caught up in memorizing these vocabulary lists, and then I'd forget how to actually put the words together into a sentence, you
Oh,
know?
yeah, I see that all the time. People get so focused on the little pieces that they forget how to actually build something with them.
Right, exactly. And another good point they made was about slowing down, prioritizing clarity over speed.
Yeah, it's a common struggle. People think, like, to be fluent, you got to talk super fast, but a lot of times that just leads to mumbling or mispronouncing things.
Yeah, I still got to remind myself of that sometimes.
It's way better to speak clearly and be understood than to just rush through everything.
Totally. And speaking of like the learning process, I thought it was really interesting how the podcast compared adult language learners to like how babies learn their first language.
Oh, yeah, that's a great analogy. Think about it. Babies, they don't have grammar books or anything. They learn by just listening, repeating, and copying the people around them.
It's pure instinct, right?
Exactly. And the cool thing is adults, we can tap into that too. Just like kids learn by watching cartoons, we can learn by immersing ourselves in, authentic content, movies, music, whatever we enjoy.
It's about making it fun and engaging, right? I remember when I was learning French, I would watch French movies with subtitles. It didn't even feel like studying, but I was learning new words and grammar without even realizing it.
Exactly. When you enjoy it, it just happens naturally. You're not forcing yourself to memorize rules, you're just picking it up.
So we've covered a lot here, and I'm curious, what's sticking out to you guys, the listeners? Are there any techniques that you're already using
Mm.
or things that you're thinking, oh, I want to try that? What are your thoughts on this whole idea of passive learning?
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. And before we move on, I wanted to touch on one more thing from the podcast. They made this point that, becoming fluent, it doesn't happen overnight, but if you just practice a little bit each day, you will get better.
It's encouraging,
Yeah,
right? Like even small efforts can make a big difference over time.
definitely.
It's all about consistency.
And finding ways to make it enjoyable, not just another chore on your list.
Yeah, exactly. And they had this one simple trick. They talked about labeling everyday objects around your house with their English names,
Mm-hmm.
like putting a sticky note on the fridge that says refrigerator, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's like you're turning your house into an English classroom, but like a fun one.
I like that, a fun English classroom. And speaking of, being surrounded by the language, the podcast really stressed the importance of immersing yourself in English as much as possible, like changing your phone's language, listening to podcasts in English, even following English-speaking people on social media. What do you think about all that?
It's all about making English part of your everyday life, right? You're not just studying it, you're kind of living in it, even if it's just for a little while each day.
Right. They also talked a lot about the importance of actually having real conversations. They told a story about their first real conversation in English, and it was with a tourist who was asking for directions. They were nervous, but they did it, and it was a good experience.
It just goes to show you that those little interactions can be huge for your confidence. It's one thing to practice with an app or whatever, but to actually use the language with a real person, it's totally different.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I bet some people are thinking, well, what if I don't know any native English speakers? Or
Yeah.
what if I don't have any opportunities to practice having conversations? They had some advice for that, too.
Oh, yeah. They talked about online language exchange groups and even using some of those AI language tools.
It's amazing how much technology has changed how we learn languages.
For sure. I mean, now you can basically talk to people from all over the world without even leaving your house.
It's pretty cool. They also warned against doing this thing that a lot of language learners do, which is focusing too much on individual words instead of learning phrases.
Yeah, they said something like, don't just learn how, learn what's up.
Right.
It's about sounding more natural, more like a native speaker.
But right. It's
Yeah.
about capturing the way people actually talk. I remember when I was learning Spanish, I would get so focused on memorizing these vocabulary lists, and then I would totally forget how to actually use those words in a sentence.
Oh, yeah, that's super common.
It's like you get so focused on the individual pieces, you forget how to actually put them together and make something.
Yep, totally. They also talked about this other thing, slowing down when you speak and focusing on being clear rather than trying to talk super fast.
That's a hard one,
Right.
honestly. I think a lot of us feel like we need to talk really fast to sound fluent,
Mhm.
but I know I end up mumbling sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely better to speak clearly so people can understand you, even if you have to go a little slower.
It gives your brain time to, like, catch up and think in English, too.
Exactly. And one more thing I thought was really interesting was the comparison they made between adult language learners and how babies learn their first language. What do you think about that?
I thought it was a really good point. You know, babies, they don't learn from textbooks or anything. They just pick it up by listening and copying the people around them.
It's all about immersion and repetition, right?
Yeah.
Just absorbing the language naturally.
Yeah, exactly. And the cool thing is, adults can kind of do that too, right? Like, think about how kids learn words by watching cartoons. We can do the same thing with movies or TV shows or whatever we're into.
For sure. It's about making it enjoyable, making it something you actually want to do.
Yeah, I remember when I was learning French, I used to watch all my favorite French movies with the subtitles on. They didn't even feel like studying, but I was picking up new words and phrases all the time.
It's amazing how much we can learn without even realizing it when we're having fun. So now that we've talked about all this great advice from the podcast, we'd love to hear from you guys. What's resonating with you? What techniques are you already using? Or what do you want to try? What do you think about this whole idea of passive learning? And as we're wrapping things up here, I wanted to leave you with a question. What's one little thing you can do today to create a more immersive English-speaking environment for yourself?
It could be something as simple as changing your phone's language or listening to an English podcast on your way to work, or even just trying that trick of labeling things around your house in English.
Yeah, every little bit helps. And the more you can make English a part of your daily life, the better you'll get at it.
We really want to hear your thoughts on all this. So let us know what you think. What stood out to you from this episode? What are you excited to try? Share your ideas and keep the conversation going.
It really is amazing, right? Like, just making small tweaks to your routine can make a big difference. Oh, and before we forget, the podcast had one more little nugget of wisdom that I thought was really important.
Let me guess. You're talking about how learning a language, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time.
Yeah, exactly. And they emphasize that it's okay to, not be perfect.
In fact, they made this point that mistakes, they're actually a good thing. Like, you learn more from messing up than you do from getting everything right.
Yeah, it takes the pressure off.
Right. Like, it's not about being perfect. It's about making progress.
It's about enjoying the journey.
Exactly. And, who knows? Maybe one day you guys, the listeners, you'll be the ones sharing your own tips and stories about learning English.
It's a journey that's definitely worth it. It opens up so many doors, both personally and professionally. Totally. You can connect with new people, experience new cultures. It's amazing.
Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive for today.
Yeah, this was fun.
It was really cool exploring all these tips and ideas with you. And as always, we want to hear from you.
Yeah, tell us what you think. What resonated with you? What are you excited to try out?
Share your thoughts, and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.